But thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate you for being here. Deeply appreciated. I would like to welcome you all to today's session. It's Friday, so we want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Tiro Mthembu. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Socially Engaged Theatre and the Director of the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre here at the University of Regina. I am also an Assistant Professor in the Theatre Department. And I've had the privilege of working in over a dozen countries across 4 continents within a variety of creative and community contexts. We're organizing this event virtually. We'd like to acknowledge the fact that the University of Regina and the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre are situated on the territories of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis Mischief Nation. The University of Regina is on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. On a personal note, land acknowledgement for me is a reminder that of our shared histories, memories, systemic realities, and the intricate collective action towards change. I am originally from Nigeria, moved to Canada in 2015, and I'm constantly reminded of some of the shared similarities in terms of our histories. The fact that Nigeria was colonized by Britain, and how language was in many ways shifted back and forth in terms of finding ways to speak not necessarily my traditional language in school, but only English. And we were actually punished for speaking in my traditional language. So while our dialogue today focuses on policing in Canada, particularly in Saskatchewan and on the prairies, and of course we have a guest both from British Columbia and from Saskatchewan, we're reminded that the discourse is relevant across the world, including my own country, Nigeria, and also elsewhere in the world. I also want to acknowledge 2 of my grad students who have been working with me on this, Luba Kozak and Ibukunluwa Fason. And I'll pass it on to Luba and Ibukun to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Afolabi, for involving me in the organization of this project and for letting me be a part of it today with all of you who have so generously offered to share your time and stories. My name is Luba Kozak, and I am a graduate research assistant at CSET, where I serve as a communications and research projects manager. I am a first-year PhD student in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Regina and affiliated with the University of Sapienza, Rome, where my doctoral research is supervised by Dr. Randall Rogers and Dr. Francesco Fredolini. I am an art historian, a researcher, an internationally published scholar, and an animal liberation activist. My doctoral research rethinks human-animal relations through representations of exotic pet animals in 18th century British portraiture, investigating early origins of species politics through post-colonial and post-humanist frameworks to offer an ethical study of the historical animal. As a Ukrainian, I also wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge the current genocide and horrendous violation of human rights happening in my country right now as a result of Russia's war on Ukraine. Slava Ukraini. Ibukun?
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ibukun Fason. I'm a producer, stage manager, playwright, producer, and researcher. As a national and international artist, my work have graced different theaters globally in London, UAE, South Africa, just to mention a few. And my interests span the broad area of musical theater, site-specific theater, and children's theater. Currently, I'm studying at the University of Regina, my PhD studies, and my research borders on spectatorship and space research in site-specific theater practice in Nigeria and Canada, with a focus on decolonizing and conceptualizing performance aesthetics. And thank you very much, and back to Dr. Tiro.
Thank you so much, Luba and Ibukun. Luba is going to give us some house rules, and then after that, I'll just do the framing of the session, and we have our 3 amazing panelists for today. Over to you, Luba.
Right, before we proceed, we would just like to cover some basic house rules. We are dedicated to making this a space of respect where everyone's opinion and experience is valid and equally important. While we hope to engage in a lively conversation and strongly encourage dialogue, a valuable tool for navigating sensitive topics, we wish to remind everyone to be a respectful listener and mindful in their responses. However, we do encourage our panel and audience to ask questions, reflect, and to feel safe in sharing their own stories. For our audience, please use the chat box to ask questions, which we will read out and look forward to addressing.
Thank you so much, Luba. To wrap up my acknowledgement, I also want to acknowledge our community partners on this project, particularly Regina Police Service, Chief Evan Bray, and the entire team for working with us and facilitating our conversation and all of those conversations that we needed to have to actually find ourselves here today. Thank you to our panelists. We did appreciate the trust and boldness you've shown to be part of this conversation. I must admit that putting this series together was quite challenging. I think in all of my work that I've been doing, this is particular one that I received more of no than yes. Perhaps because of the sensitivity of the topic or the practicality of the topic, or for practical reasons, right? But it's something that really came to the fore, and wanted to acknowledge that because we know that some of this topic can be very, very contentious. I'd like to begin this session today by framing by acknowledging the sensitivity of the topic, and that's why I started by talking about the fact that receiving more no's than yes. Acknowledging the sensitivity of the topic, but beyond that, acknowledging the vulnerability of both the panelists and the participants. So thank you for being here. If there's one thing that I have learned in my engagements in over a dozen countries across 4 continents, is the need to practice deep listening and dialogue. And in my work in community, I am always reminded that we're all in relation to one another. So it is important for us that we constantly remind ourselves that our breathing offers positive spaces for others to breathe as well. The goal of the 6th episode is to create a circle of and for conversation and to garner some shared language around critical issues on policing, particularly as it affects us here in Canada, and of course here on the prairies. One of the rules of art is to open space for courageous conversation such as this, and to encourage diverse and nuanced perspectives. We're going to have nuanced perspectives today, which is great, which is what we want, which is what is important. But then this also means that we have to acknowledge that the system, the justice, the policing and surveillance system in many countries, including Canada, is terribly problematic. It is a systemic issue. It is not an individual issue, and it is always important to always put that at the front. It means that it's not peculiar to Canada. It's not peculiar to the prairies. It's not peculiar to Regina. However, it also means that we're all entangled in the system, and we have to collectively find ways to untangle ourselves. Within the geopolitical and socio-cultural context of our present location, Regina, Saskatchewan, and of course, in the broader sense of Prairie and Canada, we're at different levels in this conversation. And then considering the peculiarity of our location, particularly on the prairies, Saskatchewan, and the past history of injustice melted against Indigenous people, Black and people of color, we have a unique opportunity to speak with and to discuss issues of policing as it affects our region. We also want to acknowledge, again, the steps that have been taken, that are continually been taken by all our various, police services, our officers. We want to fall forward so that we do not return to normal, but we can determine what we want, and that will, and the goal is at the end of the day, humanize our existence. I hope that that's the framing, that's the offering that we have as we take that step into this conversation today. With that, I'll hand over to Luber to do a quick read of our panelist bio. We also have it all on our website. So we'll be happy, in case you didn't catch it, you can always we can always go. You can always find a way to go read that. Over to you, Luba.
Thank you, Tiro. Our first speaker that I will introduce is Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies. She has led a 25-year career with the Regina Police Services. Starting her career in 1996, Deputy Davies has worked in both uniform and investigated divisions of the RPS. Lorilee has also provided leadership in community-based and human resource sections of the service and has been a member of both the public safety and the crisis negotiation teams. She has also led many operational and proactive community initiatives. Over the past couple of years, her diverse assignments have spanned managing large-scale protests and labor disputes to providing oversight as a critical incident commander on emergency service calls. Lorilee developed and leads a Truth and Reconciliation Committee and strategy for the RPS. Driven in many areas, Lorilee has also committed to increasing female membership in the RPS and for policing in this province of Saskatchewan, especially in the supervisory and leadership roles. Welcome, Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies. Our second speaker, we would like to extend a very warm welcome to Boyd Peters. He is the director of the Salis Rights. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but Salis Rights and Title Department, now known as Huilachmet. He has been elected to council for over 23 years. Boyd was born and raised in Salis, where he learned about the history, traditions, and cultural spiritual teachings of his people. He has 3 children and 2 grandsons. He is presently elected to the BC First Nations Justice Council for a second 3-year term. His portfolio for the British Columbia First Nations Justice Council and Policing and Corrections are as so. Boyd is a member on the Advisory Committee on BC Provincial Policing Standards. He is presently the president of the Salis Development Corporation, Moitelich. In 2000, he led the development of the Salis Restorative Justice Program. And in 2017, he led the development of the Salis Justice Strategy and did terms of reference for the Salis Community Consultative Group. He's a chairperson for Salis meetings with the Upper Fraser Valley Indigenous Police Unit. Welcome so much, Boyd Peters. And then final but very warm welcome to our speaker, Tiro Mthembu. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly as well, but please correct me if I'm not. Tiro is the co-owner of the Hampton Hub, a newly opened restaurant in the Heritage neighborhood of Regina, Saskatchewan. He is a board member for the Heritage Community Association, and in light of social justice, he and his fellow community members have formed a community group to address the needs of the Saskatchewan and Regina community called Heritage Helpers. Welcome and to everyone, and to Tiro, Boyd Peters, and Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies for being on our panel today. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Luba. If I may just ask, but those that are not our panelists, if you can just if you're not talking, just put off your camera, please. And we want to have our panelists put on their camera so that they, we can start engaging. Thank you so much for that. So we did one of the things that we did offer, and I would ask Boyd Peters to go. I know that you may have some of those pronunciations you want to help us with. We would love to get that on recording, please. Apologies on that. And as you get us started on that, we just want to get your thoughts on our first general prompt that we sent. That from your positionality, what would you like to speak to in terms of the policing culture in Canada? Particularly, what are the norms? What are the values and rules of policing, both from a Western and a non-Western perspectives? And I know for you, Boyd, you may want to focus more on non-Western. That's fine. Whatever direction you take it, I'll hand over to you to speak to that question. Over to you, Boyd.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak on this CSET I do have a lot of history that was taught to me by, my family, my ancestors, on culture and traditional teachings and spiritual teachings of our people, and some of the impacts that policing has had on our people, the colonization policies, and has really impacted the culture and our traditions, and with the Indian residential schools and children and families, and it's actually been pretty harsh impacts on our people. And in our community, when the police were sent in, to take away all of our culture, our language, our spirituality, take our children away, we had a saying, and that was "Me'e te kekakos," which means in our language, "Run, the police are coming." So that's always been, it's been with us, and it's always in our hearts and in our minds, and our people still feel that to this day. But I'll say that it's getting a lot better though. Notice that there's a lot of non-reporting of incidents or assaults that are reported to the police, and there's been loss of lives, and the oppression by the police, the colonial violence, and our Justice Council, wholly rejects the present policing system. We think that it needs to go towards to restore our First Nations legal traditions and structures. We need to create our own origin stories, and I'll talk quite a bit about our First Nations legal traditions and structures. And for thousands of years, we have been governed by our traditional laws, which we call Snawayeth in our language, our own creation stories, and how we respect our Mother Earth and each other, the elders' teachings and ways to discipline or correct our own people. We didn't need the police or the courts to do this for us. And we choose to lift up our people, to correct them in a good way. Many generations ago, a man was physically abusing his wife. And then, so in our culture, in our governance, we have shwalams. So they had very, very strong spiritual powers. So he just waved his kuchmin at this man, and then it changed his whole way of life. So that now he was a spiritual winter dancer, and it's no police required for that. It's just a really transformation of his attitudes and the way he was behaving. And we also have the transformer era in our territory. So khals, if people weren't living by the Snawayeth, the traditional laws, they would be transformed into stone as a constant reminder to us as what the laws are. So we don't have it written up in any kind of a law book or anything like that. It's those constant reminders of the pictographs and those stone transformation sites, those sacred sites. One example is Palachal. So Chals turned him into stone because he's a one-legged fisherman. And so he was fishing improperly, taking more than he needed. So as an example, he turned him into a stone. So he's there for us to see, every day. And another example is the Cheetmuch and Spath, which is the owl and the bear in our language. These winter spirit dancers weren't living that spiritual life as they were supposed to. So Chals turned them into stone. And there's just beautiful, prominent stone figures, almost like statuesque, on this prominent mountain in our territory. And it's always there for our people to see. And there's also pictographs that are constant reminders. They're like ancient billboards to us. So we have some that are called the peepers. So it's like a face, but you can only see their eyes and the top of their head. And to us, that means that, the younger people, the adolescents, that they're protected from seeing things. So they can't go to ceremonies, to funerals, and because their spirits are too pure. So you have those coming of age things that we have. And it's very, very important to us because we don't want our young people to get hurt. So we protect them until they're of age. And we also have naming ceremonies at our longhouses, and the sacred fires that are there means that we tell the truth. And distinguished witnesses are called to verify the work. So when people are getting names, they have to have that right to that name from the family lineage, from the history, from the teachings of our elders. So that can be challenged on the floor. And those witnesses, they're not exactly like the courts, but if there was any question or challenge to any kind of the work that happened, the spiritual work, they'll be called back and they say, okay, what was your recollection of that event? So it's very important. Strong protocols. So in our longhouse culture, we also have sacred regalia. And one time a police officer apprehended one of our longhouse winter dancers, and he had this quitchmeen, and I mentioned it earlier in my talks, but it's a carved pole, and it has deer hoofs on it, and it's very significant for when we initiate new dancers. So the RCMP officer took it away, thinking that it was a weapon, but it's used for cultural, spiritual purposes, very, very strong. And that's really hurting our spirit, and it stunts our growth. It's not supposed to be handled by anyone else, but that person has it. And an actual case that was involved in it with our longhouse traditions as well was that two young ladies who are wearing the paint, we call it salikwum, for our winter spiritual dance ceremonies, got into an altercation, and that's strictly forbidden. So rather than going through the police, we dealt with it on our own, and we had gatherings with the two longhouse groups, and I was actually the facilitator for that. And the leaders really spoke to them strongly about how they're supposed to carry themselves. And so it ended out well, and then there was some celebratory songs done after. We also do cross-cultural training for Correctional Services Canada and for the police, and they actually go on a canoe, and they get to see some of these pictographs, some of these rock transformation sites that I'm talking about, and we explain it to them, and we do a welcome ceremony for them when they want to come ashore, and they're given names, and they're explained that, you know, these names that are handed to them, they're part of the family, and then if you do something wrong, it's a disgrace on your family, and that can be taken away. So that's part of how we organize ourselves.
Wow, thank you so much for giving us that. For giving us that overview of some of those cultural practices and how that has in many ways been affected due to the policing culture in Canada. Tiro, do you want to what's your thoughts to this question, and then we'll come to the Deputy Chief, Lorilee Davies.
Yes, thank you. The police culture in Canada, if we're going to talk about norms, is we have to take a step back and look at our, as Boyd was saying, is our history of the settler colonialism. And so policing is deeply rooted in white supremacy and based in settler colonial property management. So it comes to no surprise, for instance, that Chief Evan Bray recently has posted an image of the thin blue line. And that is an image that has been associated with white supremacy. So if we look at our roots of where policing has come, we need to be able to look at that there's no space for Indigenous or people of color in that system. It was, I'm from the area around Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan, And that's where the Cypress Hill Massacre took place, which was the mobilization of police on the prairies to uproot Indigenous communities off of farming and agricultural lands, and then forced into a starvation walk across. So when we think about the culture, that's why it's not very surprising to us to look at the Freedom Convoy and the support that police showed for those folks compared to what we see when we see our land and water defenders. There is no accountability in the current justice system for people of color and Indigenous folks. And we need to think of outside of this carceral system that oppresses us.
Thank you so much, Tiro. Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies, I wonder, the historical realities has been placed on, is being offered, and this is what we've read in literature. We've read this, we've seen this in lived experience and all that. I wanted to ask you, what are the changes happening? Because you are engaged in community, you face this every single day, and would you mind speaking to the changes happening to the policing culture in the country, particularly how it affects us here in Regina and of course Saskatchewan and maybe Western Canada?
For sure. Thank you very much. And thank you to the other panelists for their comments as well. I think that, certainly we have to acknowledge the historical of policing in the country. Both previous panelists have done that. For many people, it certainly was a very negative experience. If police were in your community, it meant that children were being taken away, or traditional rituals were being taken away. And so, I think as a policing organization, as police officers, we have to understand that that's the perspective that policing sort of brings to today's climate. And so we really have to be aware, and we have to work extra hard to ensure that we are being culturally sensitive, that we do have a level of cultural competency. And I think at the Regina Police Service, we are really trying very hard to ensure that that happens. We've had an Elders Advisory Council for since the early 90s, I believe, maybe even dating back further to that. But we rely on our elders in the community for guidance in terms of how we run our operations and do business. And we really are working hard to ensure that our officers do have cultural competency, that we bring in speakers from the community to be able to tell us about the history and the challenges in the community. And that's something that we are working very hard to do currently. And I think sort of the whole just being aware of truth and reconciliation. I know Luba mentioned in my biography that that's one of the committees that I was fortunate enough to be able to start here at the Regina Police Service. And so ensuring that all members of our service, both sworn and civilian, are aware of the history and that we can work forward and look forward in terms of making sure that we are aware of the history and being able to be culturally competent. I think in terms of sort of a bigger picture, maybe provincially and nationally, in terms of the changes that are happening for policing in Saskatchewan, there is another level of oversight. It's ACERT is coming into play here in the next couple of months, which basically is an outside agency that will investigate any sort of incidents where there's been injury or death at the hands of police. And so that's something new in the province that we've never had before. And I know that many people in the community were calling for that additional oversight. So I think that that is one change that's happening. Also, there's been lots of talk about race-based data collection. And so the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police are working right now on sort of the protocol defining what that looks like. And so, we'll be happy to participate in that sort of once we understand what that looks like. How do you ask for race-based information in a very respectful way. And so we're looking forward to being able to embrace that. And we think that, that'll be important in transparency moving forward for our service. And I think, I don't want to go too long here, but the whole being representative of our communities, consultation with our communities, we're working really hard right now on an EDI strategy for the service, and really want to be consultative with our community. We understand that there, for the BIPOC community, the relationship with police hasn't always been the best. And so we want to reach out, have those conversations. And I think this today is a great example of that work moving forward.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to that same question, and I want Boyd and Tiro to really comment on that, because we've heard from you in terms of the changes, the strategies, the ideas and tactics and programming, from as someone working from the system. And our topic today is around social dimension of policing. So I would like to start with Tiro, then I'll move to Boyd. What are the changes are you seeing? And again, I also want to say that this is not, this is a conversation, right? So it's not to say that we're putting anybody on any stake here, not at all. Where the goal is to engage in a dialogue to better understand how do we need to consider from a sociological standpoint dimensions when it comes to policing. So to Tiro and then to Boyd, quickly before we move on to us, specific questions to the three of you, what are the changes are you seeing? Are there even any changes? And if there are, what are those changes you're seeing in your community or in your own experience? I'll start with Tiro, then we'll go to Boyd.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of cosmetic reform right now. We see a lot of positions of, it's important to always remember that not all of our skin folk are kin folk. So we see positions being filled by individuals of color or females, but that doesn't address the root issues that are systemic within policing in our country, which is white supremacy. So when we talk about changes, it's hard to really see changes in our community when the police do not live in our community. They live out in suburbs, they come into our community, and they use violence and intimidation and to our most marginalized and poor community members. So no, we don't see too much change. We see a lot of cosmetic reform, and we then also see, but the numbers don't lie. The numbers are still staggering when you look at the amount of officers that are white males compared to officers of color and even female representation. Yeah.
We're going to come back to the question of number, because I know that you and I were part of this CBC, quick interview about numbers and statistics. We'll come to that. Hopefully we get to that in this particular series, but this today's episode, when I know that there's another series that kind of focus on that. But I want to go back to Boyd and ask, what are there changes that you're seeing? And if there are, what are those changes? Over to you, Boyd.
Yeah, we're part of one of the First Nations that have signed on to the community tripartite agreements. So we have an Indigenous policing unit that's assigned, and it's supposed to be a higher level of service to our community. And it kind of depends, I think, on each community, the level of capacity that they have. Do they have anybody that's willing or able to, from their staff or their community, dedicate some time to the community consultative group and the Indigenous policing units? For our community, we are very active. We have a community consultative group. We meet with the RCMP, a lot of the elders and the youth that are on there, and they help to identify what are the priorities. And they also kind of identify what are the community safety strategies that we see as that are important for our people, so that we don't have to get caught up into that vicious cycle of the justice system. And we build that relationship with the RCMP and the First Nations police, because we not only involve the Indigenous police, but also the sergeant from our local detachment. And the Indigenous unit, we're having war canoe races this coming June. So we have them out there, and they're a pilot boat. So they're trying to keep other boats away from our canoes so that we don't capsize and that sort of thing. And they also join our events like our annual Christmas parade. So they set up a booth or a float, and they join us. So those sort of things are happening, but I think it's very localized. What needs to happen more is that we need to incorporate our own institutions, our own police forces, and how do we want to organize ourselves? Well, maybe we have security programs on reserve, but also maybe we have some community policing. How can we raise that to another level where we're able to actually kind of work together with our CMP? When you come to those sort of agreements, understandings, that relationship, that's what's going to make a huge difference, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know, Westy, we're going to specific prompt for each of you, and we've kind of also designed that based on what we see and your, the areas and your experience and the things that we've seen about your work. I'll hand over to Luba here to ask Deputy Chief Lorilee the next question, and then from there we'll move on to the next to Tiro. Over to you, Luba.
All right. So my specific question is for Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies. You have provided leadership in community-based and human resource sections of the service, and have been a member of both the public safety and crisis negotiation teams from this experience. What are the contradictions you grapple with in this work?
Thank you, Luba. I think that, from my personal perspective, I'm a very strong believer in community policing, engaging with the community, developing those relationships outside of crisis times, and developing relationships. But policing at its core, sometimes we do have to deal with crisis situations, and they're always hard to deal with. Obviously our main concern when we have a situation that's a crisis or very emergent, we have to keep public safety in mind. And so sometimes that does involve, using police weapons or police tactics to be able to resolve things safely for everybody, for the public, for a suspect, for a victim, and for the police as well. And so it really is sort of that duality that you need to rely on your relationships that you've created in times of good, that you have respect with the community, so that if there are situations where you sort of have to maybe not necessarily use force, but people understand that it's that situation that sort of necessitated that, and that you are acting with a good heart and an open mind, and just really hoping to resolve the situation safely. It really is, like you say, a duality, because we do want to represent the community, be there for the community, but there are certain situations where obviously the answer is that someone needs to be arrested. And so I hope that answers the question. I can certainly go into further detail if you need.
Oh, thank you very much. That was very insightful. And I really like that perspective of that duality and trying to, find balance and that kind of circumstantial aspect of each unique situation. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences on that. Our next question is for Tiro. So cultural expressions are an inherent part of social life of all communities. As a community organizer, how has or does cultural expression inform the 4 levels of policing in Canada: federal, provincial, municipal, and Indigenous?
Yeah, so I find in activist work and organizing in our community, a lot of the time it's kind of out of almost self-preservation in a way of expressing ourselves, that we come together, whether it is through dance, through, you know, I know so many artists that we use our platforms to love up on our community, because also police violence impacts the entire community. And so we have definitely, I feel, come together in our times where we are hurt, and we continue to try to educate and agitate for change. And I think if police would listen and watch as we demonstrate, as we plead for every child matters, as we plead for Black Lives Matter, it's, you know, it is very difficult. We're coming off of, every day we watch different police encounters with our community members that leave our community members traumatized. So I think it's always important to come together and utilize our platforms in love and uplift our community. And that has always been powerful for me personally. And I can see that that's continuing to impact broadly Canada, as we come together and we continue to agitate and educate that we need to have space. We need to create more inclusion in our society for us all. And so we're always hopeful that police will start to listen to us and respect us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I thought it very insightful that you touched on how art can kind of unite and be a form of expression. As an art historian, I definitely see the power of it. So historically and currently, I think it certainly is a very valuable tool. And our final specific prompt is for Mr. Boyd Peters. As the director of Salis, and I apologize again, please correct me on the pronunciation, but Salis Rights and Title Department, now known as Huilichmet, born and raised in Salis, what can the history, traditions, and cultural spiritual teachings of your people teach us and policing culture in Canada more broadly?
Yeah, thank you. When Trio was talking about how theater can kind of influence, you know, policing, and you know, as Indigenous people, you know, a lot of what we do is by how we see it, because we don't have everything kind of written down. So when we experience things like that, it really makes it clear to our people, especially our elders, because they don't want to spend like long time reading thick books or anything like that. So it just so happens last night that I went to this play in Vancouver, and it was called White Noise. And it had to do about truth and reconciliation. That's one of the huge things. And the writer of that, a young fella, I think he was only like 28. He passed away just about 2 years ago. And so it was like a tribute, and it was like a legacy to him. And it was a comedy, but it was also very, very pointed. And it was kind of offensive almost. And it was these two families that got together, a white family and a Indigenous family. And they had a supper, and the young daughter of the white family was trying to get up to 100,000 followers on her social media account. And it really hit home. And people were crying, and some people were really, really offended, but it was really well accepted. And when you look at, and it was, they kind of made it tongue-in-cheek kind of a thing, where some of the traditions of our people were kind of mocked, but it made it funny as well. But it's not funny when you look at, like I explained earlier about some of our legal traditions that we have. Those are the laws that we go by. So when you build those relationships with the governments and with the police in general, they need to understand all of those laws that we have. So if they came to some of our gatherings and our ceremonies and actually experience those laws as they happen. And it's way different from the black and white thing that you have in the court of law and with all of the rules that the government has. So when we have our institutions in our culture, it's a longhouse, and it's when we have like the Shwaikwai Mass, which I'm a part of. That's what we need for the healing, for naming ceremonies, weddings, funerals, and celebrations. And it's handed down in a matrilineal manner. So if there's an understanding from our police detachments that, you know, these things need to be understood as much as we're able to share that kind of information, because our culture and our spirituality, our sacred practices have been exploited in a lot of ways. And so we don't want them further exploited. And we need the understanding of the police services, that protocols are required, so that we say, okay, these kind of laws that I'm just kind of sharing right now aren't going to be out there and shared and exploited because a lot of it is way too sacred. So we need to have an understanding, you know, with police agencies, that we're able to share these kind of laws, these kind of teachings, and then but there's other ones that are not to be viewed or shared or to be taken pictures of or videotaped or anything like that, right? So when it comes to the laws, we're very, very particular about the safety protocols around those. So I know that we have a long ways to go. Our BC First Nations Justice Council is developing cultural safety trainings for all of the justice sector in BC here. And we're not quite done that yet because we signed off on a BC First Nations justice strategy 2 years ago now. So we're just getting into finalizing some of the work. So I know that we have a lot more work to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Boyd. I just wanted to say that when you stood up to go back, it was as if you were going into the creek and you know, it was very beautiful. You know, I wanted to just, you know, it was really beautiful. And then you handed it and then you came back. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful. Something that the three of you kind of touched on, you know, it's around relationship building, listening. I know Tiro did talk about listening and listening to, you know, to Black and Indigenous and people of color community. And of course, Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies, you did talk about those strategies that, you know, that you continue to engage in building relationship with community. And of course, how to grapple with those contradictions. I created part of a team that created a performance with some police officers in Victoria when I was in BC, and something that one of the officers said to me that, you know, I can't forget. And he said, you know, he wrote the line himself. He said, many times I have a second or two to make a decision. And within those seconds, I have many things running through my mind, especially when it's life-threatening and all of that. And he says, but when I make that decision, it can have an eternal, you know, impact on the life of that person. And so that contradictions, it's constantly there. But I want us to return back to that idea of relationship building. I think that's really it seems as one of the piece around the core of that. And maybe I want Tiro to start here, and we'll go to Chief Lorilee Davies, Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies, and then we'll come to Boyd. And I also want to tell our participants, please, you can put your question. This is when we take questions, please, and we'll be happy to read out the question. Tiro, in your own your work with community, what would an ideal relationship building looks like. And I'm asking that because and I want the three of you to speak to this from where you're coming from, because I know that Boyd is speaking in terms of the British Columbia, where specifically where they're situated. Tiro, you are here in Regina. Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies, you're here in Regina. And so the idea of, even though we're in different spaces, the idea of community building and relations seems central. What should that look like? What do we think that should look like in our own world? And if the three of us can speak to this, Tiro, you can go first, please.
Yeah, well, me and my business partners, when we opened our restaurant, the Hampton Hub, we named it Fred Hampton, after Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader, who always advocated for fighting racism through solidarity. And we're not going to fight racism with anything else other than socialism. And so I think when this relationship has to be based on sharing our resources. So when we look at the issues that plague our communities, we need mental health support. And I think that the chief of police in Regina has said that the police cannot deal with the root causes of crime. And so if we can address that, I think that what it will look like is standing in solidarity, and we need to deal with the root causes of crime: affordable housing, mental health support, food security, education. These are ways that how that relationship can be built, is by addressing the needs of our community.
Thank you, Tiro. Deputy Chief Lorilee Davies, what are your thoughts about this? The idea of relationship building, both, and I'd like you to speak really both as, not only as an officer, but even also as a community member. You are perhaps a mother, a grandmother, a daughter to some, I'd like you to speak in all of those, because those things give those layers of nuances to the conversation. Over to you.
For sure, thank you. I think in terms of ideal relationship building, it really has to be everybody equal footing, right? And what Tiro said about the root causes of crime and the root problems in our community is very true. I mean, we can't expect police to be able to deal with all of these solutions. And so it has to be community based. And so what that looks like is really, it's hard while coming out of COVID, but to have people sitting in a room face to face, speaking frankly, today is a great example of that, but just, having all the stakeholders together to be able to have those conversations. And it is difficult, right? I mean, everybody is coming from a different space, but it really has to start with just being open and really with a good heart, I think, and understanding others' perspectives. In terms of a community member, I would like to think that I would have input in terms of, for instance, what a strategic plan for the service looks like. So we're embarking in that program here shortly, where we'll be developing a new strategic plan for starting in 2023. So we want to have really good input from the community about what they want to see and what that looks like. And that'll be town halls, that potentially is a survey. I don't know exactly, but I find that it's so hard, especially I think coming out of COVID, to get people in a room together, which I think is where really that relationship building has to be. I mean, it's great to see you all virtually, but I feel like it would be much better if we were sitting in the same room together. That's really when you can have, I can get to know all of you on a personal level. And I think that really is where we have to go, is back to the basics and getting to know one another personally. And that's where, once we have trust, then that's where I think the real work begins, and the real sharing and problem solving goes from there.
Thank you so much. Tiro, I see your hand up. I'm just going to come to Boyd so that we can wrap up that question, and we come to you for I know you have some thoughts. Boyd, what are your thoughts on this? I know that you did talk about, cultural practices and artistic expressions, and how some of those things that, your community is doing, engaging, with the RCMP and all that. from your own experience and from your, wealth of wisdom and knowledge, what, and of course that includes a lot of, many years of knowledge passed down to you. So what we want to acknowledge all of that. What would an ideal relationship building looks like between the community and the justice system?
I think that when you ask that question, you look at the way that we approach our lives and our relationships with our own community and with outside, and we recognize that when we do our culture and our traditions and in our Longhouse society, that we're all considered equals, and it's a holistic wellness is what we want, for our society. And so when we look at the RCMP or the Indigenous Policing Unit or any level of government, we want them to have that same sort of philosophy that we're equal, that we're recognized, and it's not power-based. It's not that hierarchical system that the government has, and it's not the militaristic way that the police is organized. And you'll notice that in our community, in our region, that our crime rate is way lower than the general First Nations population. I do a lot of work with corrections, both provincial and federal. The amount of our people that are in those systems is way low. So the RCMP and they need to know, our traditions and our traditional forms of governance, and we need restorative approaches so that it's not guilty or innocent, or you have to go on probation, or you have to go to jail. It's about what's the best thing for this person to be able to heal. And it's that kind of relationship, so that when the RCMP, the first contact that our people have that are being maybe committed to crime is with the RCMP. So what is their initial reaction going to be? Are they going to do the presumption of diversion? So you divert them off to a restorative program, or do they send them off to court where the Crown decides, okay, is this enough information to be able to, have this guy go to the court system? So it's those understandings about being equal is, I think, not power-based, is what a relationship should be based on. Not saying, oh, the rules that you're governed by are superior to ours, and it shouldn't be that way. So that's what that relationship needs to be based on.
Thanks. Thank you, Boyd. I'll hand over to Tiro. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Boyd. I totally agree with looking at an approach of holistic wellness and restorative approaches. And I agree with the Deputy Chief about talking about the importance of dialogue as we're having here. But ultimately, our political will is based, money talks. And so when we talk about dealing with these things, we can, with the issues, the root causes of crime in our community, we have to be able to talk budget. And so when we look at huge, enormous budgets for police, when coming out of this pandemic, we are dealing with an opioid crisis. We're dealing with the cuts to social services that are making families. We're criminalizing poor people. And so I totally agree that we can have meaningful conversations, but the money has to be a part of the budget, has to be a part of this conversation. So if we have $4 million for a new airplane, we can definitely have the money to deal and address with the problems that are impacting our community, such as homelessness and food insecurity. And so again, I really would strongly, I'm encouraged by having dialogue, but we have to be able to look and question the budget, because that ultimately shows our political will. If we want to have, as Brother Boyd pointed out, having holistic wellness, we don't need a hyper militarization. And I understand in some cases that there might lead to having it, an officer use force. But currently we have a militarization budget that if we were to put our resources towards our wellness, I think ultimately we could get out of this situation that we currently are in.
Thank you so much, Tiro. And in one of the sessions where we're going to be addressing issues around reforms and issues around reforms and budget and all of that, because I think that what you're raising is very critical in terms of, you know, budgetary allocations and where that goes to, what goes to what and where, and those issues. So that's really very, 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 very critical. It boils down to the idea of the commons, right? The idea of the equal footing, like Boyd was talking about, and you were also talking about, and of course, Deputy Chief was talking about. That how can we create that dialogue, but beyond dialogue, actually take those meaningful steps to really achieve that idea of being commons, being equal footing at every level, right? Oh my goodness, that's a big question. And again, part of having this conversation is also to start raising all these other, you know, this question may have been raised before, but within the context of us in Regina and beyond that, how can we start taking these questions to the next level of what does this really mean? Who do we then need to bring into this conversation also? That would speak to that budget, or that would bring about a different perspective on that. The other thing also I wanted to point out in terms of and this is me trying to bring some of those thoughts together as a co-host, is that idea of the ideology and the ideology in which these different systems are working. Boyd did say that in their community, for example, when somebody is being caught doing committing a crime, the goal is not to get all the facts and then set them off, you're gone. Get them out of here, get them into prison. The goal is to ask, how can this person heal? And I find that really very interesting, thinking in terms of holistic wellness, that we're working from that perspective of healing. And Deputy Chief also did mention the fact that, of course, we're operating within this virtual dialogue. But when we all come into that space, I want to listen to you. I want to hear you, not just as a person in uniform, but as a human being, knowing that the person being in the uniform or behind the uniform, whichever way, that it's a human being. And I want to, again, that collective, holistic, wellness as a community. And those are the dimensions and those areas that are critical in terms of really thinking about social dimensions of policing as we're bringing that together. I'll take a pause here because this is not my panel, it's your panel. We have a question already, and this is from John. Question from John, Lily, and I'll just read that quickly. What is the best way for police officers gain cultural knowledge of First Nations people? What sort of training should recruits receive? That's a question from John. Maybe we can start with Boyd and we come to Deputy Chief, then we go to Tiro.
There's no pan-cultural distinction amongst all of our First Nations, Indigenous brothers and sisters, because we are, very distinct in all of our areas. So you can't just do one program and make it just one big general book or thing about what our culture is for the whole nation. And when it comes to RCMP, when they get placed in a certain community, where it be way up north here in BC or down south here, and where I am, we're near the US border, and there's many different First Nations in this area, but we have a tribal system here I'm in the Coast Salish. So we're the longhouse culture. And it is very distinct up north. It's quite a bit different. So it needs to be based on the area where they're from, where the police are, and where their detachment is. And it has to come from the people of that land. From here, the name that we have for that is that we're Cholmuk, which means the people of the land. So that's the teachings that they should get when they're in this area. And it's just what we do when you do your land acknowledgements, because you're saying thank you, for allowing us to be on this land. And it's that acknowledgement. And so it really needs to be specific to each area. And that's when I mentioned earlier that we're doing a cultural humility training for the province of BC here. It's not going to be the same for each area of the province. It's going to be according to what the culture and the spirituality is for that given area. And that's going to be a big part of the training, the cultural training. And it should be experiential as well. It's not going to be by video or a webinar or on a book. It's going to be from the people of that land. So that's the way it needs to be, because experiential is like I mentioned earlier, that's how we learn best, because they give you that opportunity to have that two-way communications, and it's a full discussion, it's a full conversation, it's a full learning opportunity. So that's the way it should be.
Thank you so much. Experiential learning. Deputy Chief.
Thank you. I agree so much with what Mr. Peters just said, and that's really at RPS what we are trying to do. We have local elders from Treaty 4 who sit on an advisory council to our service. They, like I said, provide guidance, but also direction for us. We host annually, outside of COVID, a teaching feast for all of our employees. So our elders, we have the feast, they explain all the different protocols, why things are done in that way. And then we also host a round dance. So again, our local elders are very involved, but our officers get to attend, they get to experience, we invite the community. It's such an excellent event. And I'm fortunate here, joined Constable Frank Kovacs as a member of our Cultural and Community Diversity Unit, but they're doing great things within our service about sharing stories, experiences from our Indigenous members, their different backgrounds, telling their stories. And sharing really our elders' teachings. We have an Eagle staff. And so what is the significance of that, so that our police officers get a chance to understand, not just generally speaking, the history, in Canada, but specific to RPS and specific to Treaty 4. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing. But I think in an ideal situation, you would have a representation of many Indigenous officers within our service, and then that's one-on-one conversation, learning from each other.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. Tiro, do you want to take it on?
I'll pass. I really respect what Mr. Peters had to say, and I agree.
Thank you. Okay, maybe you might start us. There's another question here. And I'm posting that for everybody to see. I'll try to read it. What other strategies can be used to decolonize the power dynamics between the police force and the public? What kinds of police training ongoing would offer alternatives to weaponry, abuse, or violence? What would a community-oriented system look like in the classroom, in the street? Tiro, maybe you might, again, it's totally, if you want to start, you want to reflect on that.
Well, I think what kind of training inside that institution is hard to see I think that's why we need to advocate for concepts outside of the institution of police. We need to look at a just and safe society where people have affordable housing, where they have the mental health support, the domestic violence support, and ultimately then we don't need to have such militarized tactics used. So yeah, again, I think that we should look for ways of healing outside of an institution that uses violence.
Thanks, Drew. I mean, the other question to ask, and this might be a bigger conversation, do we, as a public, and maybe Deputy Chief, maybe this might, you may speak to this, you don't have to, it's just a thought for me. Do we, as the public, do we even have access to the police curriculum to know what it looks like? And that's just a question, because thinking in terms of what other strategies, we have to know what are the existing strategies, right? So that's just a question. But I'm just posing that again. This is the reason for dialogue, right? So we ask questions. We don't necessarily have answers to all of them, or even to to some of them. But it's something for us to even think about. Do we even have access to that curriculum to know what it is? They have been officers have been trained about it. I'll turn it turn over to Deputy Chief to speak to the question that has been asked, if that's okay with you. Not necessarily to my question, just this question, because I know that my question, it was just an afterthought. Just thought of it.
For sure, absolutely. And I think it really does sort of go back to the the root causes of crime, right? If you are able to deal with addictions in the community, homelessness, food insecurity, a lot of these crisis situations don't involve a police response. I think it would be naive for us to think that there won't be situations that require police. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of situations in our city that require a very high level of emergency response in order to be resolved safely for everyone. And some of that does require the use of weaponry and, for instance, our Rescue 1 vehicle. So, at the end of the day, it would be great to not have those things, but sometimes those tools are required in order to be able to de-escalate those situations to the point where it is safe for all members of the public, police, suspects, victims, speaking of everybody. In terms of what would it look like if we had an alternative to that, I mean, I think it's, I love Mr. Peters talking about their society is hopeful to be able to basically police themselves. I mean, it won't be policing. It'll be they deal with issues in the community through traditional means, and it would be great for us to be able to get to that point someday. I think that it does involve sort of addressing those root causes and really trying to come up with community-based solutions essentially. And so what does that look like? I think it is dialogue, it's sitting down, it's the city's community safety and well-being plan. I think that really is a good starting point in terms of getting a lot of people at the table to figure out what needs to happen in the community. In terms of your curriculum question, so all of the Regina police officers are trained at the Saskatchewan Police College, and that's mandated through the Saskatchewan Police Commission. I'm not sure if the curriculum is available. I think it might be, but I unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it, but I don't think that there would be any mystery to sharing it if it isn't available publicly, but I don't know for sure if it is, sorry.
No, thank you so much. And maybe, maybe we might follow up with you on that and ask if it's something that we can. It's just a question that I just thought about, because when we're asking about other strategies, we want to know what's the strategy they have been trained in right now, right? Before we can even propose other strategies. Obviously, anyways, I'll leave it at that. Like I said, it's not my panel. I wanted to go back to, I know we have just 9 minutes here. We'll ensure that we finish on the exact time contract. It's really important. But I'd like to maybe, there are two questions here that maybe we can also, quickly speak to, and I'll start with Boyd here. Should the public have input into the police training curriculum? Should the curriculum be guided by the people police serve? Maybe there's a way we can also tie that to the previous question around what should a community-oriented system look like, as particularly around training now. Since Tiro and Deputy Chief, you've kind of weighed on that question. Maybe but can help us focus on that in terms of this question around training curriculum.
One of the things that each of our First Nations communities, our governance structures should be thinking about right now is going back to our historic structures for governance. So for our community of Sta'alis, we have a 60-year vision, and in that vision, it has for us to operate our own police force. We know that that we don't want to replicate, that foreign system. Some would say it's a broken system of the police force, and we want to rebuild our own institutions and to be self-determined and culturally appropriate. We know firsthand what our people would require, and I don't think that we would have our police force to have weapons and to have the kind of authority where they're going to be, first option is to throw our people into the court system or into jails. It's going to be something where it's going to be based on growing our community justice programs, that we have an option for them to go to a program, whether it be addictions or employment, education, but something that is really stable and ongoing, because we don't want any of our people, especially our younger ones, getting lost, being assaulted or brutalized by the police. I went to an event not too long ago, just last month, and it was called Justice for Jared. And he was a Wet'suwet'en man that was in Campbell River, and he was killed by the police there. And he was 28 years old. He had been sober for 8 months or 8 years. And they sigged the dogs on him, and the dogs ripped him up, so much so that they had to have a closed casket. And when you look at those kind of things, the guy was trying to help himself. But what prompted the police to use excessive force and kill the guy? And I was talking to the mother at that event, and she was just totally devastated. And she's going to keep on with this movement. And we need these kind of movements so that these kind of things don't happen no longer. It's too much of our people are getting killed. So we need to do something about it. And the way to do it is to rebuild our own institutions, rebuild our own police forces, if that's what communities want, or nations. And that's what needs to happen. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. I know we have 5 more minutes, and I'll still ask the three of you to just speak quickly, just your final thoughts. But I just wanted to, I know there are other questions that are popping up that time won't allow us to take. But wanted to really, speaking in terms of military skills versus human skills here. How much of how much of the attention is focused more on military versus the human skills. And I think that, that humanizing, that the social cultural dimension around policing is really very critical. I will leave it at that. And I would say that just in 30 seconds, if we can go around, the three of you, just your final thought. I'll start with Tiro, and then we'll move to Deputy Chief, and then we'll go to Boyd.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the other panelists for being a part of this dialogue. I think that we need to consistently agitate and educate police forces to listen to us. We need to be Black and Indigenous and marginalized communities need to feel loved, and we need to have space to heal. So we need to stop militarization in our communities and start to allow us to heal and look for a world beyond this carceral state. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Chief.
Sorry, I think my internet isn't super great. I might be delayed here a little bit. Yeah, just to wrap up, obviously, I want to thank you all very much for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I really think the way forward for policing, not just in Regina, but in the country, is through conversation, consultation with community, having those hard conversations, and really just being understanding of each other's perspectives. And, I think in terms of what Regina Police Service, what I would like to see, obviously, is more diversity amongst our members, because I think that really, when we are truly representative of the community, is really when we will be more a part of the community, and hopefully everyone sort of feels included in, can see themselves in policing, and that relationship is just all the more improved. So that's what I hope we can continue to do moving forward.
Thank you. Boyd?
Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to have a respectful dialogue, and I didn't mean to offend anyone by anything that I might have said today, and hoping that everybody had an open heart and an open mind to hear my perspective. And I know that transforming this relationship between the police and Indigenous peoples towards one that is open and honest and transparent and accountable and founded upon the recognition of jurisdiction is a really fundamental part of the reconciliation process. And our community, we have a security program. So they work with the RCMP, and that's probably leading up towards a community policing program where our people, we're right here, we're in the community, and they're gonna want to approach our program first before they will any others, like the RCMP or the Indigenous police. And it's about working together. So I think that's a step in the right direction, and our local detachments are really open to that. So this is what really needs to happen to make things better for our people.
Thank you so much. And I speak for myself. Obviously, you didn't offend anybody, and you don't have to apologize at all. I think that this is what dialogue is about. We're in community. We're speaking with one another, not to one another, not upon one another, but with one another. So thank you for that open heart for sharing. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for your questions. I know we couldn't get to all of them. We'll try to put all of that together, because there are some of those episodes that we have that those questions clearly speak to them. I also want to apologize that our ASL is not available today. For some reason, I think there was a break in transmission somewhere, communication somewhere, and that might be on my own part. So my apologies for that. We'll make it available for our next episode. Our next episode is on the 20th of May. Again, it's the same process of going and register online, and you have access to it. Thank you so much. Thank you to Luber and of course to Ibukun for taking the time and working with me on this. And thanks to Tiro, to Deputy Chief, and to Mr. Boyd Peters. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for being here. Deeply appreciate it. Do have a lovely weekend. Bye, everyone.